In this lecture, we're going to look at the rise to power of Ngo Dinh Diem, who became president of the Republic of Vietnam, which we would today call South Vietnam. Diem was a relative unknown in his own country, and his path to power was rather unconventional and surprising to many observers at the time. Diem was born in 1901 in Hue, the capital city during the Huynh dynasty. His father was a civil servant, and the family belonged to the Catholic minority in Vietnam. Diem's full Christian name was Jean-Baptiste Ngo Dinh Diem. Early on, Diem was in a Catholic seminary studying to become a priest. He later left the seminary and began studies to become a civil servant or a mandarin in the system. For a little more than a decade, Diem rose through the ranks of the colonial bureaucracy in French Indochina, and he made something of a name for himself with his aggressive actions against Vietnamese communists and radicals. He quit his job in protest in 1933 after French authorities refused his suggestion to create a Vietnamese legislature. And Diem did not work in another government position in Vietnam between the years of 1933 and 1954. Diem was approached by the Japanese during the Second World War to become part of the occupation government. And after the war, he was approached by both Ho Chi Minh and Bao Dai to become part of their prospective governments. Diem refused all three offers. Diem was a man who believed he had a destiny to rule Vietnam, but in the 1940s he would not take advantage of any of these opportunities in projected power-sharing arrangements. Diem faced a number of significant hurdles in his efforts to rise to power. As a single man, Diem was something of an oddity in a culture that highly prized the traditional family and family lineages. Only 10% of Vietnamese were Roman Catholic at the time, and Catholics were viewed with a degree of suspicion by many Vietnamese Buddhists, who represented about 80% of the population. Diem spent many years overseas during the French Indochina War, most of which in the United States, and this kind of worked against him in building any sort of political base in Vietnam. More importantly, though, Diem was virtually unknown in the South. He had lived most of his life in central Vietnam. Diem also possessed some cultural biases against the southern Vietnamese population, who he viewed as somewhat amoral and insufficiently committed to fighting communism. However, despite his political weaknesses and relative unknown status in Vietnam, Diem had many supporters in the United States. As a Christian, Diem appealed to many Americans who tended to view him as someone who was more like Westerners, at least in terms of religion. Pictured on this slide is Diem meeting Cardinal Francis Spellman of New York City, a religious leader sometimes described as America's Pope for his power and influence in American political circles. Cardinal Spellman was among numerous powerful Americans to whom Diem turned for support and for connections. There was an interesting connection also between Diem and Michigan State University in his rise to power in Vietnam. The image on this slide is from 1952. It features Diem discussing politics with MSU professor Wesley Fischel, F-I-S-H-E-L. Fischel led a consortium of academics and politicians known as the Michigan State University Vietnam Advisory Group. This group wielded considerable influence within the Eisenhower administration. Fischel and his family later moved to Vietnam during the Diem regime. The goal of the group was to help South Vietnam create and structure its central government. One Michigan State professor, Ralph Turner, later became the principal advisor for the police and security forces of Vietnam, South Vietnam. The project resulted in numerous contracts between Michigan State University and the American government, totaling over $25 million. No small sum in those days. That would be more akin to something like $100 million today. The image on this slide depicts Diem greeting faculty and students at spring commencement at Michigan State in 1957. He is just to the left of center. Michigan Governor G. Menon Williams declared this day to be Ngo Dinh Diem Day. Later in the war, Michigan State University received a great deal of criticism for its role in promoting Diem. A Ramparts magazine, which is depicted here, the cover, published a 1966 story examining Michigan State's involvement in South Vietnam. The principal argument was that Michigan State acted as a front for the CIA. The reporter detailed the large number of Michigan State staff who assisted the Diem regime from its inception until 1963. After the French left Vietnam, Vietnamese Emperor Bao Dai began to look for a prime minister who could help stabilize the South, which was in danger of collapse in the absence of French forces. Through his efforts to promote himself in the United States, Diem began to seem like someone who could attract American aid and authority. Though Bao Dai intensely disliked Diem, as did the French, and as did the Americans on the ground in South Vietnam, and almost all other political factions in Vietnam, Bao Dai appointed Diem as his prime minister in June of 1954. Again, Bao Dai was looking for someone who could have connections outside the country to help support the regime, and it looked like the United States was the only place where that was going to be after the departure of the French. The Central Intelligence Agency was perhaps the American institution with the most significant role in helping Diem rise to power. Pictured in this 1954 photo is Colonel Edward Lansdale, chief of the CIA's Saigon military mission, along with Diem. Initially, the CIA attempted to bolster Diem's rule by engaging in sabotage and subterfuge in North Vietnam. One of the most significant campaigns of the CIA was to frighten hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese Catholics in the north to flee to the south, creating a massive refugee problem. Propaganda, again in large measure influenced by the CIA, caused Catholics in the north to believe that they were going to face harassment and even death if they remained in the north. Originally, the Geneva Accords called for national elections over the entirety of Vietnam, both north and south, to take place in 1956. However, in July 1955, Diem announced a referendum that would be held to determine the future of the South, and he simultaneously disavowed the national elections that were scheduled for 1956 as spelled out in the Geneva Accords. Doing this, all of this, by the way, with U.S. approval. Diem faced Bao Dai, the emperor. Diem promised a republic, and Bao Dai promised a constitutional monarchy. Diem won the election with over 98% of the vote. This was an election, I should add, that was marked with significant fraud. In Saigon, Diem received over 600,000 votes, even though only 450,000 people were actually registered to vote. Interestingly, the CIA advised Diem to print his ballots on red paper, while those of Bao Dai were printed in green. In Vietnam, red is associated with good luck and prosperity, whereas green is often associated with bad luck. This was kind of a subtle way to influence the election. But in many other cases, there was more outright fraud, from bribery to stealing of ballot boxes to intimidation at the polls to achieve these numbers. However, 3 days after the referendum, Diem announced the creation of the Republic of Vietnam, naming himself as the country's first president. This action was in violation of the Geneva Accords, which again were designed to create a unified Vietnam. But it did have the backing of the United States, and from this point forward, there were two governments claiming to be the true representatives of the Vietnamese people, and this would be a showdown for an extensive civil war into which the United States would play a major role. That brings to a close our brief look at the rise to power of Ngo Dinh Diem.